This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, 90% of the drugs we take are generics, and the vast majority come from overseas. How can the FDA make sure they're safe?
A number of the sources I've interviewed say those inspections are essentially staged and don't really reflect the quality, the true quality of the plants overseas.
American drug oversight in foreign countries when Radio Health Journal returns.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
I think it's universally true across various industries, be it restaurants, be it retailers, be it households. People don't know how much they're wasting.
In the U.S., nearly 40% of food produced ends up in the trash. Then,
it's going 17,000, roughly 500 miles per hour. And as soon as it hits the atmosphere, everything starts to heat up.
Commemorating 40 years since the birth of the NASA Space Shuttle. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
Slightly more than half of all Americans take at least one prescription drug. Those who do take an average of 4 different drugs each. Most of those are generics. In fact, generics make up 90% of all the drugs prescribed in the United States. But do you know what's in them? Most of us know only that generics are supposed to be pretty much the same as the name brand. But are they?
Well, they're supposed to be. So they're not a carbon copy, but they're supposed to be a version. And the bioequivalence, which is basically the absorption into the blood of the drug, is supposed to fall within a range that is approximate to the brand name.
That's Catherine Eban, Fortune magazine contributor and author of Bottle of Lies, the inside story of the generic drug boom. And she says that we have to be more careful about generics than the standards would make us think. Time and again, drugs have been recalled for containing less of what they're supposed to or more of what they're not.
There have been glass particulates in drugs. There has been drugs that are tainted with carcinogens, some of which have been used in the production of liquid rocket fuel. There have been cases of metallic fragments. There are cases of drugs that are not bioequivalent. They don't dissolve the same in the body. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners who have been taking blood pressure medication that has been subject to recall because it had carcinogens in it. That's an instance in which all of these generic drug manufacturers bought this active ingredient that was being made in India and China, did not test it properly, and carcinogenic materials were in the final drug, and millions of Americans took those drugs, and now they've been recalled from the market. But it took years to figure that out.
The problem, Eban says, is globalization. In 1984, the U.S. overhauled the rules on generics, giving the first company to get a generic okayed protection from any others for several years. At the same time, the law approved the import of generic drugs manufactured overseas. It turned American manufacturers into foreign ones.
We used to be a huge manufacturing hub. We made antibiotics for the entire world. First, antibiotics started shifting to China. The labor costs were lower. The environmental regulations were basically non-existent, and there's a lot of waste product that is created in pharmaceutical manufacturing. By 2005, the FDA had more plants to inspect overseas than it did domestically. And basically, Western drug companies started realizing they could vastly decrease costs and increase profits by shifting overseas, and foreign manufacturers started moving into our marketplace and getting FDA approvals.
Today, the vast majority of generics are made overseas. More than a half come from India and China. And Eban says most of the time it's not a trusted U.S. pharma company making a generic version of its name brand drug.
That happens, but that is really the minority. Really what's going on is that there's companies you've never heard of that are often operating in very remote parts of India and China that are, in some instances, employing illiterate farmers to come into the manufacturing plants and suddenly be operating in what's supposed to be a highly regulated, sterile environment. These are plants where FDA investigators have found some of the bathrooms don't even have drainage piping. Think about that. There's no sinks to wash hands. And these are plants where the sterility requirements are so strict that you're not even supposed to move quickly because it can disrupt airflow. So this highly regulated manufacturing that our lives depend on has been moved 7,000 miles away from the oversight of the FDA.
And that makes a difference, though the FDA says it doesn't. They claim the same standards and inspections apply for foreign manufacturers as for domestic ones. But EBAN says the truth is a different story.
To inspect a drug plant in the U.S., the FDA just shows up whenever they want. They don't announce it in advance, and they stay as long as they are needed. Overseas, the FDA will actually announce its arrival weeks and sometimes months in advance. And that has given these overseas plants the opportunity to fabricate manufacturing and quality data, to shred documents, to rid plants of insects and birds and lizards in order to put its best foot forward for the FDA. So a number of the sources I've interviewed say those inspections are essentially staged and don't really reflect the quality, the true quality of the plants overseas.
EBAN says she even has evidence that fake pharmaceutical plants have been set up overseas, designed expressly to dupe drug inspectors.
That happens in China, where actually plants will pool resources and have one show plant that they'll direct investigators to. And because most FDA investigators can't even read the street addresses, they don't know that they're inspecting the same plant over and over again.
EBAN says part of the problem is that the FDA is simply overmatched watching over manufacturing plants all over the world. In some parts of the globe, such as Italy and the UK, the FDA relies entirely on those countries' inspectors and trusts that they do a good job. But elsewhere, the FDA does its own work because local inspectors may not be much help.
In fact, they do have regulators, but one of the things I uncovered in my reporting is that the Indian regulators really are functioning more as an arm of industry. I mean, they are, in some instances, seeing their jobs as protecting the industry as opposed to protecting the patients.
So just how often does all this occur? Enough to be frightening. In her book, EBAN follows an FDA inspector named Peter Baker who found a way around all the tricks.
Instead of asking them for documents about their manufacturing, he looked in their computer systems. And what he discovered was widespread tampering with quality data. So this is critical data that shows whether the drugs pass specifications or not. And he found through tracing the metadata that there was widespread fabrication. Over the course of 5 years, of the 86 plants that he went into in India and China, he found data fraud in 67 of them. It's about 4/5 of the plants.
But why do generic makers feel they have to cheat? Apparently, there's comparatively little to lose. EBAN says if they happen to get caught, it can take years for enforcement to stick. And she says the penalties don't match the potential reward.
What the companies want to do, as I've discovered, is they want to try to game the system, put their thumb on the scale, and maximize the chances that their drug is going to get approval, it's going to get approval quickly, and that they can be possibly first to market. And if they're first to market, they get additional profits and more market share. So in order to do that, they have, in a number of cases, fabricated data. They're literally getting approval for drugs they don't yet know how to make.
However, with all the difficulties in inspecting foreign manufacturing plants, the easier and more sure safeguard might be to inspect the drugs themselves once they reach our shores. Except EBAN says that doesn't really happen.
There is really no systematic testing of the actual drugs. One of the reasons for that is it's very hard to test the quality of millions of pills, right? How do you do that? And if you test one pill, how do you know that that's representative of the million pills? And that's why data is so important to manufacturing quality, because the idea is that the data serves as a kind of step-by-step, minute-by-minute blueprint of the manufacturing process. Regulators are looking at the process of the manufacturing rather than just the final outcome. Now, that said, we do need systematic testing as yet another sort of layer of protection around our drug supply, but that's not really happening right now.
Despite all this, Eban says don't throw your hands up in despair. It doesn't mean the whole generic industry is untrustworthy. Or does it?
It doesn't necessarily mean that, and obviously generics are critical to our drug supply, and they're critical to our health. But the fact is that when Americans go to a drugstore and get a prescription, and they're getting switched from one generic company to another, or from a brand to a generic, they really are getting switched through very different levels of quality from manufacturer to manufacturer. Some are functioning perfectly and within the rules, and some really are not. And data fabrication is an incredibly widespread phenomenon in this industry.
But while generics make up the vast majority of drugs we take, Eban says there's actually even more at stake than that. Brand name drugs exist in the manufacturing shadows as well.
80% of all the active ingredient in all our drugs are coming from overseas. As one drug importer said to me, without these overseas ingredients, not a single drug could be made. What it boils down to is that patients are really at the mercy of and dependent on the companies that are making the final drug formulations. You're dependent on Ranbaxy or Merck or Johnson & Johnson or any drug manufacturer to vet the materials that they're getting, to scrutinize and test the active ingredients. And they're supposed to make sure that the active ingredient is not contaminated.
However, many of us can't take a named brand. If there's a generic available, insurers may not let us ask for it. It all means that safety, to some extent, is up to us. We have to pay attention to who's making the generics we get at the pharmacy, especially if we're switched from one manufacturer to another. That's about all the information we have to go by.
Right now, there are no regulations requiring country of origin labeling. So if you, on your dispensing label, you'll see the manufacturer, but you won't know where the drug was made. But what I'm recommending to patients for the moment, until laws can be changed, is let's say you take a maintenance medication and it's working, which is great. Then you got to be aware of who that manufacturer is and try to make sure you don't get switched to a different manufacturer. But also, if you're thinking that you're having problems, you're having side effects, the drug isn't working properly, and I think a lot of people have experienced that, then what I would recommend, do a Google search. Put the name of the manufacturer in, FDA, and the words warning letter, and see what kind of sanctions the company has gotten.
Eban says there have been some congressional rumblings for change. It's a national security issue if it's impossible to get an antibiotic made in the U.S. But until then, we're on our own more than we know. Eban says you can find guidance for patients on her website, KatherineEban.com. You'll find a link on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. I'm Reed Pence.
Cardiovascular or CV disease is the #1 killer of adults in the U.S., and millions of people trying to reduce their risk of a heart attack or stroke may unknowingly be taking medications that are not proven nor FDA approved to reduce cardiovascular risk. Let's hear from cardiologist Dr. John Osborne.
Many people are unaware that after a failed outcome study, the FDA withdrew the approval of fenofibrate when added to statins as the risk outweighed the benefits to heart health. It's important to remember that statins, along with diet and exercise, can lower cardiovascular risk by about 25 to 35%, but persistent cardiovascular risk, which can lead to a life-threatening event, may remain. I would tell anyone still being prescribed fenofibrate, such as Tricor, Entera, and Trilipix, with a statin, to talk to their doctor about FDA-approved therapies for cardiovascular risk reduction.
To learn more and get clear on the facts, visit itscleartomenow.com. Again, that's itscleartomenow.com.
A third of Americans think we will all be eating meat-free diets in the future, and the future is closer than you think. A recent survey of 2,000 Americans conducted by OnePoll reveals the average person thinks we'll all be meat-free by 2039. That's just 18 years away. Of the 52% surveyed who don't think that going plant-based is realistic right now, 1 in 5 worries that it's too expensive. But Vegan Strong National Tour Director and multi-sport athlete Robert Cheek says think again.
Plant-based eating can be incredibly affordable if you focus on eating fruits, vegetables, beans, rice, nuts, and seeds. Going vegan is better for your health, your wallet, and the earth.
During the pandemic, more than half of people have even made a game of cooking at home, and more people than ever have found themselves trying new foods they never thought they would. For more information, check out veganstrong.com. That's veganstrong.com.
This report is brought to you by Bristol Myers Squibb. Beta thalassemia, known in its most severe form as Cooley's anemia, is an inherited blood disorder characterized by low levels of a protein called hemoglobin, which plays an important part in the function of healthy red blood cells. While considered a rare blood disorder in the United States, beta thalassemia is much more common throughout the rest of the world, with an estimated 1 in 100,000 with the disorder. Patients often require frequent blood transfusions to help with symptoms of anemia, such as fatigue and breathlessness, and to restore red blood cell counts. International Thalassemia Day was on May 8th and was dedicated to honoring those impacted by these genetic blood disorders. Maria has been living with beta thalassemia since childhood.
One of the issues I have found is that living with such a rare disease means I often lean on my community for support and to help me find appropriate healthcare providers. I encourage others living with beta thalassemia to find their voice and take an active role working with their care team to maintain their health.
Craig Butler, National Executive Director of the Cooley's Anemia Foundation, adds,
patients with beta thalassemia may experience chronic anemia and fatigue, all while navigating a rare condition that is not widely understood. That's why it's so important that we educate people about this disease and support this community.
To find resources and support, visit thalassemia.org.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Radio Health Journal is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.
Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
It will take a variety of different things to, in effect, give them a lollipop of some sort after they're vaccinated as an immediate reward.
Reaching herd immunity. If reason won't get people vaccinated, maybe incentives will.
Then, improving health care in underserved communities.
Where you live, in some instances, your zip code determines the quality of health care that you have and the access to health care that you have.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.